When the show starts, a lot of these players are getting interviewed, and in each of these interviews, they say the same thing. I just got to keep my head down, get the grades, play well, get out of here. But after a couple of episodes, it's like these guys forget that East Mississippi Community College is not their final destination. They start skipping classes, missing practice, getting into trouble, and their guidance counselor continues to tell them and tries to remind them, look, this is not your final destination. If you keep doing this stuff, you're never going to get picked up by a bigger school. You're never going to leave scuba. These guys continually slip back into forgetting that they are on a journey, that scuba is not their home. They forget that they are, in fact, pilgrims at Last Chance U. And in that same way, we so often forget that we are actually pilgrims on this earth, and this is not our final home. But these Psalms of Ascent are meant to remind us of that primary identity that we forget, that we lose sight of every day, suffocated by this world that we live in. And these Psalms provide a way to remember who we are and where we are going. And Psalm 120, the first of this collection, is meant to begin us on that journey by showing us this, that because Christ has secured us an eternal home, we must cry out to him at distress at our present circumstances. Crying out in distress at our present circumstances is where this journey starts. It is this crying out in distress that wakes us up to the reality of our eternal home, and it begins our journey. I want us to see that because we have an eternal home, we are to cry out in distress for 3 reasons this afternoon. First, we cry out in distress because of the lies we call truth. Second, we are to cry out in distress because of this exile that we call home. And finally, we are to cry out in distress because of the answer we have and will receive. First, we must cry out in distress at the lies we call truth. Let me read again verses 2 through 4. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. What shall be given to you? What more shall be done to you, you deceitful tongue? A warrior's sharp arrows with glowing coals of the broom tree. The distress in the psalmist's voice is evident. A distress cry issues forth, concluding with the calling down of arrows and coal upon a lying tongue. What's interesting here is verse 2 doesn't go quite as we would expect, though. Verses 3 through 4 are expected, the calling down of curses on a lying tongue. That's expected. But verse 2 is different. He's crying out deliverance from these lies. A cry for deliverance comes when there is no hope and no strength left to help ourselves. A cry for deliverance is saying, save me. And here, the psalmist is saying, Lord, save me from these lies. And then verse 3 through 4 are that plea to destroy the lies. Now at first look, again, this seems routine. It's like we would expect. But this cry for deliverance at the beginning sets it apart. Because the psalmist does not need deliverance from lies that he already sees in the world, that he recognizes as deceit and as a lie already. That would be an enemy that's far off. That would be an enemy that can be spotted and avoided. One that you do not need to cry out for deliverance from. So there's no need for the verse 2 cry for deliverance to be referring to these big lies in culture that he sees already, or lies that he knows that he's already speaking. He's not crying out for lies that he has already spotted and that he knows are there. These lies, the deceit that he's crying out for rescue from, that he's calling down judgment and curses upon, it's a real and present enemy because he's surrounded by them. He's entangled by them. He's struggling not to fall into believing these lies. And often, he's being overcome in believing these lies. He's falling victim to them, so he cries out for deliverance. And recognizing that he's near powerless against the force of these lies, knowing that there are lies he is believing and being consumed with, he cries out in distress for deliverance. I can't wait to see the movie Dunkirk that recently came out. I haven't seen it yet, but I've been reading about it for the last month or two. And it's so intriguing for me because it's not the normal movie with main characters, their character development, and then a linear plot. Instead, it's a prolonged look at one single event that happens in history. In May of 1940, Germany made their way into France. They trapped the Allied troops on the beaches of Dunkirk. 400,000 men were surrounded and trapped, and being picked off like fish in a barrel. They had no shot of escape on their own. They had no protection, no defense against this enemy that surrounded them. And And because of this, a massive mission involving civilian and military forces had to be staged to save these men. Because they were entirely surrounded and without hope, they had to be delivered. They knew who their enemy was the entire time. It was the Germans. But when these Germans were far off in Germany, they had no need for deliverance. It was only when they were completely surrounded, entangled, and besieged by this enemy that deliverance was needed. And this is just the sort of picture that this psalm is painting of these lies and deceit that he sees as enemies that he needs deliverance from. The lies are not the easily recognizable storylines of our culture that can be picked off and easily avoided by the believer. They're a much greater threat. These are the sort of lies that he is struggling not to believe and often losing to, succumbing to, and believing. When I first read this text, I pictured the lying tongue and the deceit as things such as atheism or abortion or the gratification offered through drugs or through the things presented in pop culture. Something I clearly spot in the distance as that is a lie. I don't need to believe that. But the problem is these are not something that I presently, right now, need deliverance from. I hate that they are such a large part of our culture that people do believe these lies, but I don't struggle with these things right now. But there are other, far less overt and obvious lies that I don't even realize I've allied my mind with. And I have to cry out at distress for deliverance from them. I need to be delivered from the lie of fulfillment. I think fulfillment can be found in my relationships, with my friends, with my wife, with my standing in community. When I'm not fulfilled, I lose my joy, complain, and am an anxious wreck scrambling to fix things so that I can once again find fulfillment. I need deliverance from this. It's so insidious, so deeply ingrained in my heart and my spirit that I don't even realize that it's a lie. I need deliverance from it. Each of us have lies like this in our life that you believe, that you must cry out in distress for deliverance from. It's not the far off lies that stand in our culture that we need present, immediate deliverance from. It's the ones that we already have allied ourselves with, that we struggle, that we are already believing them. And we must cry out in distress for him to shine his light on our life and destroy these lies with the warrior's arrow, with the burning coals, that we may need sharp pain for these lies to be removed from our life. Maybe it's the lie of control. You think that you can manage your life or the lives of those around you according to your plans, and that everything will turn out okay if it just goes how you have pictured it. This infests your relationships with others, yourself, with the Lord, and when things do not turn out right, you're bitter, anxious, and you scramble for control. Maybe it's the ever-present lie of materialism, thinking that hard work, money put away for your future, and providing things for yourselves and others will bring you life, a new car, a new piece of clothing, something like a membership to a country club, something material that can secure your happiness and joy, or so you think. The trouble, again, with these lies are they are not easily identifiable. We need our Lord and Protector to deliver us from them. But there is a feeling that goes along with believing these falsehoods, and recognizing that and confessing that with a cry of distress for deliverance is the first step on our pilgrimage. One author puts it this way: people submerged in a culture swarming with lies and malice feel as if they are drowning in it. They can trust nothing they hear, depend on no one they meet. Such dissatisfaction with the world as it is preparation for traveling in the way of Christian discipleship. The dissatisfaction, coupled with a longing for peace and truth, can set us on a pilgrim path of wholeness in God. Lord, let us know and see what we believe, that we believe lies that are far more dangerous than we recognize, and deliver us from their power. Secondly, we must cry out in the distress at the exile we call home. Look at verses 5 and 6. Woe to me that I sojourn in Message, that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. These two places, Message and Kedar, are really, really far apart places and peoples in the ancient world. One is a group of grassland dwellers of the far north, and the other are Arab neighbors of Israel to the southeast. So what they're meant to represent is the entire world, the whole pagan or Gentile world that surrounds the people of Israel. And the psalmist is saying that he's been living in this world that is totally opposite from who he is and what and where he is truly from. He is for peace, and they are for the opposite. In fact, they hate that peace. They hate what he stands for. This can be no home for him, and he is crying out for deliverance from his exile. Something funny happens when you've been gone from home for a really long time. You begin to forget what home and the people there feel like. Pictures and a phone call with them might help remind you, but you begin to forget. It's like losing something out of the corner of your eye. When I met my wife Jess, she was living in Lexington, where I was living too. But after a month of meeting, I knew she was the one I was going to marry, but I had to leave and head to Montana for 3 months. After like 2 months of being there, the craziest thing started to happen. I actually began to forget what this woman who I wanted to marry looked like, physically. I forgot what her voice sounded like. I couldn't really grasp. It was like looking at something out of the corner of my eye of who this person was. I began to forget. Again, it's like looking at someone out of the corner of your eye. You know they're there, but you can only get like a sense of them. You can't fully place them or remember them. It's like smelling a scent that brings back memories of a really long time ago, or trying to remember a dream. And then I came back to Lexington and to Jess, and it was like waking up from that dream. She was real. Her voice was real. And I think this is what the psalmist is getting at. He's been living in a place far from his true home for far too long. He has begun to forget what it feels like. The place between Message and Kedar, his exile, has begun to feel far too much like home. He is for peace, but when those around him are constantly for war, and when they hate that peace that he stands for, he's going to forget what peace feels like. And we too are in exile, but we so often forget that we are in exile, and we don't quite know what home tastes and feels like yet, and so it begins to slip from our grasp, and we make this exile that we're currently in our home. We become too content with our patterns of life. We begin to live for this life and not in light of the coming and present kingdom. Our jobs become primarily about promotions and standing and making money, and we forget that we work to bring Christ's rule to bear in every area of life. We go to school for the grades and for the experience, forgetting that we ought to be seeking our Father's wisdom in all things. We become far too accustomed to the way that the world does relationships, and we find ourselves gossiping, self-promoting, allying ourselves with popularity and power, rather than giving ourselves for one another, or giving ourselves for the least of these, as Christ gave himself for us. We raise our children to be good little boys and girls, focused on how their behavior and performance reflects on us, instead of recognizing that it is our duty to train them up in the love and admonition of the Lord. We need to cry out in distress at this. We must cry out for deliverance to our Father, that we do not remember what home and he feels like. We have lost our sense of home and have begun to make it here in this world. Father, deliver us. Finally, we must cry out in distress because of the lies we call truth. We must cry out in distress because of the exile we call home. And finally, we must cry out in distress because he has and will answer us. There can be nothing more lonely and terrifying than a cry that goes unanswered. My first experience of true crippling fear and suffocating terror came from a kind of humorous experience to look back on, but one that as a little child left quite an impression of fear and terror as I was crying out for help and no one was there to deliver me. I had become obsessed with rock climbers and bungee jumpers and the like as like a little 4-year-old kid. And anyway, I thought that I could make this happen for me. I thought that I could be a bungee jumper. And so I took those little cords that parents will use to strap a Christmas tree on top of a car. They call them bungee cords. I thought they were the same thing. And I took a bunch of them, and I tied them all together, and I climbed the tallest tree on our property, attached these said cords to the back of my pants, and I jumped. By the grace of God, I did not plummet to my death out of this tree. Somehow the cords held, but they did not quite work like the Daredevil's equipment. Instead, they caught me about 10 feet from where I jumped, still hanging about 20 feet up in this tree, with the worst wedgie you can imagine. But there I was, hanging halfway up a tree, and no one was home. This 4-year-old kid was hanging in a tree by his pants, and I began to scream and shout for a neighbor to hear me, for someone to hear me, and there was no one. So I hung in this tree for hours. The realization led me to pure terror. Here I was in a place of absolute fear, needing deliverance, and there was no one to help. And if this psalm ends here, with a cry of distress, longing for deliverance from lies, and a cry of distress, longing for deliverance from exile, then we are given no hope. If there is no answer, then this psalm ultimately should lead us to keep our mouths shut. Accept the lies, accept the exile. There is no deliverance for you. But look at how the psalm starts. Go back to the very beginning. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Our call to cry out in distress at the lies that we call truth, at this exile that we call home, is necessitated and based upon the fact that we have a God who has already answered us in Christ and who will answer us with his coming kingdom. Brothers, Christ was the definitive and final answer to both issues provided in this psalm. Before we ever even knew that we needed to be crying out in distress, God provided the answer into the deliverance in Christ. There are lies that ensnare us that we need freeing from. Christ paid the penalty and has freed us from their ensnaring power. We now and should believe his truth. We are in fact in exile, and this world is not our home. This is not the bad news, but this is the best news. The reason we are in exile, the reason we should be in joyful exile, is because we are on a journey to our final home, to the home Christ returned to the right hand of the Father to prepare for us, to the new heavens and the new earth that Christ will bring, and will be our eternal home. Think about how living with this knowledge gives us the power and courage to live as pilgrims, to begin this pilgrimage. One of the characters from this first season of Last Chance U is this guy named John Franklin III, and he ends up being the backup quarterback for the team. He never really gets a lot of playing time, but then he gets in one game and he scores like 6 touchdowns in front of scouts from Auburn. Soon after that game, he receives an offer from one of these scouts, and it totally changes the rest of his time in scuba. You would think that he would only be thinking about the end of his exile there. You'd think that because he knew it was coming to a close, that he would one day be at Auburn, that he'd begin skipping class or practice or whatever, just to kind of finish his time out there and get on to the next thing. This is not at all what he does, though. Instead, knowing that this time in scuba is just a pilgrimage and that it will come to a close and he's heading to a much better home of Auburn, he changes. He knocks out his classes and he finishes strong. He remains good friends with the other guys, encouraging them and challenging them. He's given a brand new energy for his time in scuba because he remembers that he's in exile and he's going to a better place. The psalm reminds us who we are and where we are going, in the same way that going to Auburn reminds John Franklin III of who he is and where he's going. We are pilgrims and exiles heading to the coming new kingdom. We are entangled and ensnared by lies and by the feeling that this is our home. Our cries of distress that we need deliverance from this begin the pilgrimage of reminding us that we are people bought with a price, given the truth, and a new home. Thank you. Amen.
Yeah.